RTS campaigns tend to depict a series of battles that together represent a single war or operation. No matter the game, the outcome of each engagement is important, with victory normally being a necessity to progression. This is a bit of a generalisation to be sure, but whether you're Raynor's Raiders starting a planetary insurrection, the Brotherhood of Nod attempting to kick GDI out of South Africa, or the 16th Infantry Regiment storming Omaha Beach, there always seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what's on your screen and what's described in the story. Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to talk about a problem of scale, something that most RTS games seem to struggle with. Let's look at a couple of games as an example. StarCraft 2 is a kind of obvious place to start. It's got a 200 build limit, so if we're playing as Terran, that means an absolute maximum we can have is 200 Marines. If we start to mix in more powerful units, this number drops considerably, so minus our SCVs, we're probably talking about a total force of somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 units. Sure, we can build more when they die, but we're never going to get to control many more than that at any one time. Command & Conquer didn't have a hard unit cap, but you're still limited by both the resources available to you and the size of the map that you're playing on. In this skirmish map, I've decided to harvest all of the Tiberium on my half of the map to see what I can build with it. I've ended up with what you might call a full infantry company, about 160 men, plus a tank company with 20 or so vehicles. 2 companies does not an army make, it doesn't even make a regiment, let alone a division, so it's hardly the sort of army that you would imagine you would need to take on the worldwide forces of Nod and give Kane a good kicking. I thought I'd try the same thing again in Company of Heroes, but even when I captured the majority of the map to raise my max pop to the highest it could be, I could only build about 2 rifle platoons and a support platoon, which isn't even a full company. I guess the title Half a Company of Heroes doesn't have the same ring to it. If you're not sure exactly what I'm harping on about, it's worth taking a minute to think about scale when it comes to warfare. When we're talking about wars, they're normally fought between empires or nations, or inside them when it comes to civil wars. Even if we roll back the clock several hundred years or more, the big, important battles that had a notable impact on the outcome normally involved tens or hundreds of thousands of people. Even the biggest battles aren't always exactly what you might imagine in your mind. It's not common that every soldier in an army turns up on the same field and fights in a huge long line with everything being neatly concluded by tea time, like you've seen in Braveheart or Return of the King. This was more common in ye old days, but since people developed better transport options than legs, battles tend to be more mobile endeavours that take place over a far larger area and normally over a greater timescale. You might have heard of the Battle of Kursk, often noted as the biggest tank battle of all time. This involved a couple of million men, took place over a 160-mile front and went on for something like 6 weeks. This is obviously an oversized example, so let's look at something a little smaller. There were several important battles fought during the Spanish Civil War, but if we're looking at engagements that actually had some effect on the overall campaign, even the small ones like Irun still involved a few thousand men on each side and took over a week to conclude. That's the thing. What normally gets labelled as a battle is in fact a collection of far smaller engagements that happen at lots of different points across a far larger area of terrain. No single one of these more minor actions dictates the entire outcome of the battle. Instead, the result is a culmination of the conclusion of all of them as a whole. But how to represent this in a game that generally has you controlling no more than a couple of hundred units, and often far less? I guess you could argue that each one of your units is representative, and that each soldier you control actually represents an entire company, and each tank an entire battalion, but this feels a little weak sauce to me. I've played tabletop and roleplay games, so I can use my imagination, but it still doesn't really gel with me when you start to think about it in a bit more detail. If each soldier is supposed to represent 200 men, then what about the map? Am I supposed to believe that each house is actually a town, every cliff is actually a mountain, and every priest in Age of Empires is actually a walking cathedral? If I wanted to control a walking cathedral, I think I'd probably look to Warhammer 40k instead of 15th century France. If the units I have in an RTS are not representative, then this creates a problem. You start to feel like you're watching an episode of the 90s TV show Sharp, where the biggest battles of the Napoleonic Wars are represented by about a dozen extras running down a hill.
According to this profile, you should prove useful.
Most RTS games sell your role as the mighty commander.
Give the lieutenant something important to do.
But if I'm some super amazing commander that all of our hopes and dreams rest upon, then where the heck is my mighty army? Unless the game specifically gives me a reason to believe otherwise, then I can only really operate under the assumption that I'm actually participating in a far smaller part of a bigger battle. And the problem with this is there are very few battles where the entire outcome is decided by one tiny part of it. I don't mean to deride the outcomes of smaller actions, they are all necessary and can have a great impact on how much men and material has to be spent to achieve victory. But they are, by their very nature, just one small cog in a far bigger machine. Now some games are a little smarter than others on how they handle this. If you look at many of the missions from the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert, they are actually smaller operations. And although what happens in the game engine doesn't quite tally up with the briefing, you're often fighting over a specific building or base rather than leading a major armoured fist. From a gameplay point of view, it's very easy to see why these limits exist. If you're expected to direct each individual unit, then there's only so much you as a player can handle at once. Real life generals don't tell soldiers what to do, they tell colonels what to do, who tell majors what to do, who tell captains what to do, and so on down the line. However, it's pretty much established that RTS games tend to happen on this sort of scale, and if you want to be responsible for bigger actions, then you need to move out of RTS into hybrids like Total War, and then up to grand strategy like Hearts of Iron. I think the solution is to choose the right story and setting for the kind of game that you're hoping to create. I do sometimes wonder why RTS games always seem to focus on large military forces, ancient warring empires or science fiction space wars, when really those settings just aren't that appropriate for the scale. It's akin to making a new version of Theme Park, where you're only allowed to build a park bench and an old rusty swing on a bit of dirt road round the back of a housing estate. There has to be a better approach than this. Surely situations exist that better support the size of forces you actually get to control. Write a good enough story and you can sell any scale. Your protagonists don't need to save the world or the galaxy. Smaller stories can work just as well, and sometimes better, as the struggle feels more grounded in reality. Maybe you're in charge of a minor unit protecting a remote sector, or the survivors of a bigger operation that are just trying to get home. There are countless books, movies and real-world examples where this is the case, and they can be just as compelling as any global war or alien invasion. The other option is to put a lot more effort into properly representing scale. The Angry Mob from Command & Conquer Generals was a small cluster of about 20 individuals that operated as a single unit, which seems to be a perfectly reasonable way to represent a group of soldiers in a game that actually features bigger units like tanks and artillery. You don't even need to bother with a health bar. If the unit takes damage, just remove some soldiers. I wonder if there was ever a game that really decided to go down this route. I've got a tiny fragment of a memory sitting at the back of my mind, and I think I might have seen this approach somewhere before, but I can't bring it any further forward, so if you could think of a game like this, then let me know. I guess this is a little like how the units in the Total War games work, but as I mentioned earlier, I consider these games to be more of a hybrid or a genre in their own right rather than a pure RTS. Company of Heroes and Dawn of War 2 do group units like this, but nothing like the scale I'm talking about. Some games have a different approach, and if we look at Total Annihilation or one of its more modern predecessors, they don't really put any limits on the number of units you can build, so the scale problem takes care of itself. However, these games don't really play out like the more traditional RTS games. They require a totally different mindset to get to grips with, and having thousands of individual units running all over a huge map isn't to everyone's taste. Now that gaming PCs are a lot more powerful than they used to be, it's not so much of a problem to handle this without everything running to a halt, but it's still a very different style of game and probably one that isn't appropriate for a lot of settings. I would like to see a bit more consideration when it comes to scale for future RTS games. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll get it. The thought process going into some of the more recent games or those currently in development appears to be either pick a game and make it again, or build a game first and then write a story around it. I'm guessing that future releases are going to be a lot less like Waterloo and a lot more like Sharp's Waterloo. Hi there! Thanks for sitting through me rambling about scale for the last 10 minutes. If you've got anything to add, leave me a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, then the like button requires your immediate attention. I've got a Discord if you want to get in touch, and if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.